Okay, welcome to JVB Live, coming to you from Hawaii. Still getting a stream quality updated. Stream quality is adjusting because of my stinking bandwidth. And the thing is, I did some tests over the last few days, the last 2 days, I suppose, to figure out how much my bandwidth was. And I should have adequate bandwidth to do a live streaming like this. I'm not really sure why it's not working. I got to call my service provider and perhaps upgrade my hardware or something about that. But I have some people that will be checking in to see what the feed looks like here. Hopefully, will send me some comments in a bit. But yeah, it is peak week. Peak week. It's also a pretty religious week to come through. So we should see the peak in the coronaviruses. And this week, hopefully, maybe next week, into next week, and also we have Easter. It's a religious holiday this weekend, so kind of a strange, unique time to go through this. I will hopefully be checking in on a regular basis to chat with anybody who wants to listen. But a couple things I wrote down over the last few days. So I'm on this this movement to try to get people to just take a step back and get rid of the emotion, or at least recognizing the emotions there and might be interfering with the way people think, and then reassessing, reevaluating what where we are. So first, I want to talk about the models. So the modeling, I guess the Washington State model, or whichever model they have of Washington State that is informing a lot of the public, has revised down their estimate of the number of deaths based on actual information. So that's good news. What I heard reported was that it's scaled down from about 90,000 deaths all the way down to 82,000 deaths, so saving about 8,000 people, which is good news. Hopefully that's the case. And modeling is interesting. So early on in this crisis, I was a little uncomfortable with these death rates because the death rates fluctuated so much country to country. And of course, that begs an explanation, right? So you have a numerator and a denominator. You have the numerator, which is the number of fatalities, and you have the denominator, which is the total number of people who contract the disease for COVID-19. And what we knew was we knew pretty well the numerator, the number of deaths. You could test people who died and see that they had COVID-19. And then the denominator was elusive because really the only numbers you had were the cases that were positive, the people who came in and got a test. So you didn't have people who got sick, stayed at home, recovered, didn't go see any health professional, didn't have the need to, never got tested, maybe perhaps thought they had the common cold or the flu. So we really had no idea of knowing what that denominator was to get these death rates. So you had this wide variance. You had Korea with 0.5%, and then you had Italy with over 6%. So the stream is still not doing so well, from what I'm told. So anyway, okay, good. So it's working a little bit better. So my upload is about 4 megabytes per second. My download is somewhere around 12 megabytes per second. So it should level out. I found I had to close all my programs. It also might be a hardware issue. So one computer was a little bit lower speed, whereas the other computer was higher speed. So maybe I have to go to the other computer in a future broadcast. But numerator, denominator, that's how we get these death rates. Wide variance between South Korea, China, here, Italy, Spain. And so you see those European countries with the higher death rates, up 4, 5, 6%. You see South Korea with one of the lower death rates, about 0.5, and this is determined by wide-scale testing. Well, that makes sense, right? The more testing you do, the more people you find out are COVID-19 positive, and that's going to increase your denominator and therefore decrease your death rate. Well, if you don't have a lot of tests, or your tests are not working very well, or you get a lot of false positives or a lot of false negatives, you turn people away from testing, which has happened here in the US, then that shrinks the denominator and you get I would think, an artificially high death rate. Um, so that was something that I was kind of thinking about over the last 3 weeks. Is we really don't know what the denominator is. So this wide scale death rate is elusive, and what you're seeing is the models are changing. They're getting updated. Of course, we had two studies out of Great Britain. One was pretty dire, and another one, I think, out of Oxford was a little bit less dire, more optimistic. And so the whole point is the experts and the Okay, I'm back. Got cut off from the bandwidth, which is strange. So I did the test this morning for my bandwidth, and I think I was alluding to earlier, I had about anywhere between 10 and 15 megabytes per second upload, and anywhere from about 3 to 6 megabytes per second, 3 to 5 megabytes per second upload. And from what I'm reading online, that's plenty in order to stream live. So I'm not sure if the issue is that there's just too many users right now that are streaming, or if it's Periscope, or if it's here in my house. It's very strange. I don't understand what's going on. Anyway, um, so I was talking about math, and I was talking about the numerator and the denominator to get the death rate. And so I was just talking about the denominator, right? So we have all these, the denominator is only as good as the information we have. And the reason that a country like South Korea would have a larger denominator is because they have to do more testing. More testing, you get more people who are either positive or negative, and then you have the same. You know the number of deaths because you're just keeping track of the number of deaths attributing to COVID-19, and that's why you get a zero point 0.5 death rate in South Korea versus say 6% in Italy, where perhaps your testing is not as full scale as South Korea, or you have a higher risk population, which seems to be the case with older people, and um, and so here in the U.S., our testing was not very great, and so our denominator I would say, would be artificially lower. It doesn't account for all the people who got sick, didn't go to the hospital, didn't really see a doctor, never got tested, and therefore didn't present in the statistic. Now, what I heard today, which is pretty interesting, is that the numerator might also be in question. Uh, and why would the numerator be in question? Well, we are likely doing more tests for fatalities now. And if COVID-19 is found inside of a person's system at the time of death, it's going to get attributed to COVID-19. And whereas before, it may just get attributed to pneumonia or some sort of old age or some sort of complication with an illness, and it might not necessarily be directly tied to coronavirus or COVID-19. So, um, because of that, you might actually have an artificially enlargement of the numerator. And so you can see how, depending on what you're counting and who you're counting, you could have a wide fluctuation in that death rate. Now, the spike, the ramping up and the exponential spike in the death rate is a real thing and certainly overwhelming certain facilities. So that's still a real concern. But I thought that was very interesting that you had divergent models of these death rates, and you really don't know for sure what the numerator is, and you don't know for sure what the denominator is. We have an idea, we have a good guess, and I get into this back and forth on Twitter about these models and experts. I developed a healthy skepticism of experts, probably 10 or 12 years ago, based on some expert opinions that I received that were just not the greatest opinions. Um, my wife got diagnosed one time with a id. What was the diagnosis? Like an id reaction to fungal infections. She had like a rash on her hand, and we were trying to figure out, how to get rid of this rash. Do we do a topical treatment? Is there something she can take internally to get rid of this rash? And the doctor she saw concluded that it was an id reaction to fungal infections. So basically, her mind was creating this rash. And it turns out that later after this, we just cut gluten back in her diet, and the rash went away. So it might have been a gluten allergy or something like that. So that's where I started to develop this healthy skepticism of experts. Now, I have that. Other people have that. I think a lot of uh, mathematically inclined people might have that. Engineers uh, or people in economics, disciplines where you can get led astray fairly easily from pretty elusive, somewhat convincing paths forward that turn out to be wrong. Maybe in medicine, that's the case where they have a healthy skepticism of studies. That's why they want the double-blind clinical trials, etc. Now, imagine that you grew up, you went through school, and you weren't that comfortable with math. In fact, you didn't like it. You didn't like it in high school. So you stopped taking math as soon as possible. Now, when I was going through high school, I think you could stop at like pre-calculus or maybe one lower than that. I can't remember. But if you stayed into it, then maybe by your senior year you were doing calculus. Um, and then if you start taking more math in college, you would do higher level math, linear algebra, and that kind of thing. Well, imagine that you're not that person. You're more of the artistic mindset. So you stop math as soon as possible when they let you, and you just kind of maximize your artistic courses: English, writing, art, music, uh, any of those other disciplines, any of those more traditional liberal arts disciplines. And so that happened in high school. And now you've gone to college, you've majored in some sort of liberal art, maybe English or maybe political science or something like that. And you've gone on and gone on. And so your math background has atrophied over time because it's not a muscle that you've been using for that long. So your comfort level is not that high with it. So when people start bringing up numbers like a numerator and denominator, you just, I didn't like math, and you have this emotional connection in your mind with not liking it in the past, and therefore um, having an aversion maybe to going through those gymnastics with figuring all that stuff out. So what you end up doing is you end up clinging on to an expert that might confirm your prior beliefs. So confirmation bias. So there's a lot of criticism now about believing the experts and not believing the experts, and they should have believed the experts early on. And the problem is that the experts didn't agree, and we can see the modeling not agreeing, and we can see that the divergent numerators and denominators are making it a little bit more confusing. Um, we can, experts have the ability to interpret different models and different results and feed back in real time information into the models, and those models can get better and better. But as a layman who doesn't have a lot of familiarity with some of these disciplines, you can cling on emotionally and, dare I say, irrationally to one expert or another expert to confirm your prior beliefs. So, for example, back in January, February, you had people early on calling this a big deal, a much bigger deal than was being presented in the media or in the politicians. And those were experts that were looking at the data and playing it forward and perhaps coming up with their own simplistic modeling of sorts, but they had this premonition that things were going to get really bad. And then and the doomsdayers, more so in hindsight, would cling on to those models and say, "See, I told you so," not believing these experts back 2 months ago. And then on the other side, you have what I would say more of the deniers who, hey, this is just the common cold, this is just the common flu. It's going to turn out to be almost the same as the common flu, if not maybe a little bit worse. It's going to be seasonal, which it still could be. And they clinged on to the experts, to include the World Health Organization, all the way up through, into February, who were basically downplaying all of these things. That it's not going to be a pandemic. The World Health Organization was tweeting in January about this wasn't going to, this couldn't spread between people. That this was purely animal to person. It couldn't transmit between people. That turned out to be false. So, but you can see people clinging on to those experts to justify, hey, this is no big deal, nothing to worry about. We just shuttle through and get through this ordeal. And really, both sides were wrong. Both sides were wrong. And so, why were they wrong? I have a sense, and this is just a hypothesis, a working hypothesis, that they latched on to experts that confirmed their prior beliefs, and they might have had a emotional reaction to understanding the math or the technical stuff behind some of these models and some of these expert opinions. So that's just something I've been thinking about over the last couple of weeks. Take it for what it's worth. Comfort with math. I mean, think back to high school. Were you comfortable with math? Were your friends comfortable with math? The people you see criticizing, maybe amongst your friends, were they strong in math? Were they weak in math? And when you kind of talk through those numerators and denominators, do you see people kind of rolling their eyes because they don't want to engage in that, or maybe not fully understanding the implications of how when you shift one, it makes a big difference in the outcome. So that's the first thing. The second thing I was going to talk about was ventilators, and there's this big criticism or critique of this local and federal, let's say the state and the federal response to this crisis. And I think it's fair to say, and I tweeted about this over the last 12 hours or so, I think it's fair to say, and I saw this opinion piece in the New York Times about the coronavirus basically laying bare the importance of Europe-wide public health and therefore the importance of the EU public health policy that lives up to the challenge. So this is kind of an op-ed about the EU situation, which, as you are aware, has universal health care across almost, I think, all their nations. And so in there was a quote that said, "It is not set up to manage continent-wide crisis like pandemic, nor does it really have its own resources. It relies on member states deciding case by case to help out." So let me read that again. This is a New York Times op-ed about the EU crisis management regarding COVID-19. Quote, "It is not set up," and it being the pandemic response or the public health task force at the EU level, so at the higher level. Quote, "It is not set up to manage continent-wide crisis like this pandemic, nor does it really have its own resources. It relies on member states deciding case by case to help out." End quote. So the reason I thought that was interesting was that you could just apply that almost exact same quote to the U.S. situation and what we're seeing between the federal government and the states, different governors. So it's fair to say that the U.S. wasn't alone in stockpile preparation, and that federal versus state issues are not unique to the U.S. The EU is going through this exact same thing, and in many cases they're in a lot worse off situation. So I thought that was very revealing. A lot of criticism with the federal government piping in ventilators and piping in PPE into the existing logistical structure. So the commercial structure, which the critics will say will drive up the price point of the PPE on the market, people charging 3 times the normal cost of personal protective equipment, and perhaps jacking up the price of ventilators. Now, the only evidence I've seen of this so far, and I think I did get some friends of mine tweeting at me some posts that perhaps would shed more light on this high cost of transaction. But it seems reasonable to me on the surface to not reinvent the wheel in terms of supply chain. So in other words, if you have an existing supply chain, 700 warehouses in certain states, there's already an existing structure where product goes into distribution centers, it goes out to warehouses, the warehouses go out to hospitals, etc. I don't know why you would set up something in parallel to that and think you could do it more efficiently or better. It does make sense to me that you would fall in line with the existing structure and pump that full of product. And this is what has been shared in the nightly press conferences by the task force, and pump that out to the different locations. Now, the critique is that because there's limited capacity, limited supply of this material, that ultimately where it goes, whether it goes to this state or that state, is determined by the highest bidder. And the only evidence I've seen has been what the governors have been saying. I haven't seen media reporting on this. I haven't seen investigative journalism on this yet. So if it's out there, I want to read it. That's a problem. And I think that's a valid critique. If that's happening and there's gouging prices, I think the federal government should step in and price control. I really do. And I think that they have every right to do that. So they could price control and keep in line with the existing supply network. Now, it's unclear to me to what extent the administration knows about price gouging. It seemed to be that the president, when he got up, at least as of a few days ago, was saying, "Hey, if that's happening, call us. We want to fix it." So hopefully that's happening and it's getting fixed. I don't know, but that's been a big critique that I've seen recently. So what else? People still trying to stay entertained. There's been some really funny videos posted of people putting music to people, tripping onto hot tubs and whatnot. This one from Andrew Sullivan that I retweeted is just so funny. I was crying. I was laughing so hard. So if you want to see that, go look at my Twitter feed. And Bill Gates is in the news talking about this. Of course, he had that TED talk. I don't know what it is, 8 or 9 years ago, talking about the next pandemic, and making some suggestions. So, I've dealt with emergency preparedness response in really both of my current jobs. Well, one former job, but my current job, and basically so I'm in aviation, and insurance companies like to see that the company has a good plan in place for emergency response. So aircraft sadly might have an accident, and then the way the company responds to that accident in the first 10 minutes, the first 30 minutes, and then throughout the next couple of days with that accident, whether there's fatalities or not, really says a lot about the operation of the company. And so I've gone through many drills, many emergency response drills, many in the last 5 years or so, and I've actually had to execute it on multiple occasions. Sadly, fortunately, no loss of life. Minor incidents. So and so far they've gone fairly smoothly. Now they weren't that serious, no loss of life, so I'm sure that would have exacerbated things. But all that to say that I've seen this drill process of an emergency response happen in real time, and I'm the guy in charge of the response. So I've seen it work. I've seen where you're rusty with it or you're unfamiliar with it, that there's some really growing pains, and you start to learn a lot through that process. And so, and if I turn over the job that I had to somebody else, and they've never done they've never done it for real life, they've never drilled it. The first time they drill it, there's going to be some problems, and maybe the first time they do it for real, there's going to be some problems. Even when I delegated some of the operational control piece to other employees, when they dealt with some sort of unique scenario, you could see a little bit of the friction, and you want to kind of jump in and help them out, but you also want them to learn from getting their feet dirty and getting into the mess, and they're going to learn a lot. And the next time they do it, they're going to do it better. And so you as a leader, in a small company and maybe in a medium-sized company as well, there's a fine balance between stepping in and intervening versus letting your people grow. It's not so urgent that you need to step in necessarily, but there's this growing process. That's the whole point, is there's this growing process with turnover, with new teams, with new people, and take that to the national level. So you have different administrations that come in. There's a new administration potentially every 4 years. That's pretty high turnover, and at a maximum every 8 years. And so the problems that are going to face each administration are just going to be slightly different than the administration before. You have new people, you have a lot of new appointees, you have some holdovers, you have a lot of information with what's important, and you got to make priorities, you got to set priorities, and you got to decide what you're going to pursue, what you're not going to pursue. So there's no doubt that there could have been better emergency preparation for this type of event. Some sort of drill where you run through and, hey, it's hitting, and here's the information we have, and you have a whole team dedicated to feeding this scenario to the reaction team. And to what extent that occurred, it could have occurred. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. It doesn't look like it did. But really what happens is, if you've never experienced something before, and this is the other part of it, so you can build experience through the drill process. But even if you hadn't experienced an actual emergency situation before, then when you're in it, you just gotta sack up and lead and react and respond and get the job done. And I think that's I think that's what the administration is trying to do. I really do. I think that they're in that mindset of, hey, here's a situation, here's a cards. We just got to go. We just got to get in there and figure out what's going to work the best. And I think their intentions are good and honest, and I think that they're trying to do the best they can. I give them the benefit of that doubt. Now, many on Twitter, of course, don't, and many critics don't, and that's fine. But my reading is that they're trying to do the best they can. Now, it's a fair critique to say maybe their best is not the best, and maybe there are better ways to do it. That's fine. I have no problem with that. However, when you're in that uncertain, new black swan, the military, there's a term, surviving first contact. So you have this beautiful plan, how you're going to attack the enemy or defend the enemy, and you're really curious to see how your plan is going to survive first contact. So you have this exotic, extravagant plan, and if it's too rigid, which is a big problem, if it's too rigid, as soon as first contact happens and situation develops where the plan is no longer applicable, that can be pretty bad if you can't adjust from your plan. We used to have this term for that in the military, falling in love with your own plan or being a self-licking ice cream cone and not being able to survive that first contact with the enemy. So I would say that my grading of the current administration and their handling is that their prior plan was lacking. There wasn't a very good plan. It goes back to the quote from the EU in the New York Times article that really the system set up in place nationally was designed to be a backstop to the states, to have the states do the frontline intervention, and then the federal government would backfill all the holes. And it seems to me that that's what they're continuing to pursue. Now, the states may not agree with that approach. Some states may agree with that approach, but it's an easy critique to say, no, really the federal government should have all the responsibility. And I don't know if that's entirely a fair critique. I mean, maybe that turns out to be the better solution down the road. But comparing what the system was prior to this event, prior to this pandemic, and the way it's operating now, and saying that the mistake was the federal government should have been the first line of defense, isn't really honest, I think, because it really was never set up that way. So just keep that in mind as you go through and hear the critiques and hear the echo chambers at the New York Times and the Washington Post about passing blame and the reporters asking questions. I do want to say that my impression is that the task force is doing a pretty decent job. They're giving a lot of numbers, but I do understand some of the criticism I've heard recently about contextualizing the numbers. So we hear a lot of raw numbers, raw data about the number of PPE, the number of masks, the number of ventilators, but we don't hear the context of that. Okay, that's 50% of what we think we need, that's 75% of what we think we need, and or whatever the case may be. Now, there is a little bit of friction because, and I see this in the military structure a lot, where you have decentralized command, centralized control, or maybe I reverse that, decentralized control, centralized command. So you have all these units that have a lot of freedom of maneuver to accomplish the commander's intent. So you have different units on the battlefield, and the commanders have a lot of freedom. But they all have to be in alignment with commander's intent. And there's always this back and forth between a unit level and higher headquarters about the unit saying, hey, we need this, we need that. And the higher level headquarters need to make an assessment if they have limited resources. Do you really need that? Are you just saying you need that? Do I have what you need? And the stuff that I have, would it be better purposed for other units? And those are hard calls. And at the unit level, you may shake your fist at higher that they don't understand, they're not listening. But at the higher headquarters level, their perspective is, look, I understand that perfect world you'd have 10,000 rounds or 100,000 rounds for this next 2 weeks. But the threat to you or the risk to you is, from my perspective, a little bit less than this other unit who has a much higher likelihood of getting probed by the enemy and attacked, and I'm going to dedicate my ammunition more so to them. And you might be pretty upset with that, and maybe the commander's wrong, maybe the higher headquarters is wrong, and you end up getting attacked and run out of ammunition. But you don't know, and at the different levels, you're constantly just trying to make the best decision you can given the information you have on the ground. And really, at the end of the day, that's all you can do. And it seems to me that that's the approach that the administration is taking, is that we have resources, we don't have a lot of resources. We need to try to position our resources to be best served where they're needed the most. And each individual state doesn't necessarily have the bigger picture available to them. They might have very, very detailed information about the state available to them, but they may not have the bigger, all 50 states with, the 5 or 6 hotbed states right now, hotspot states. So for them to critique the federal response is kind of critiquing something in a little bit of an information vacuum without all the available information to them. Again, that's fine. I just want to shed some perspective on what we're hearing out there in the media and in the public. So that's really all I want to talk about today. Thanks for tuning in and listening. It sounds like I'm still having live stream issues, and I'm going to continue to push on and see if I can get that figured out. But at any rate, JVB Live, I'll be doing these routinely. I'm going to try to do it at a scheduled time, but with the way my family situation, 4 young kids, is right now, it's just a little tricky. So maybe on review or rewind or replay on Periscope, and I'll start uploading these to YouTube at some point. But maybe that's in order going forward until I can get a consistent schedule. So thanks for watching. God bless. Have a great week. Safe week. Stay healthy. Stay strong. Those who are being personally impacted by this with family or friends, thoughts and prayers to you. I just learned of a person who has COVID-19, is in critical condition right now as we speak. So it's now impacting me and some of my friends and family in a very personal way. So if that's your situation, or it becomes your situation this week, let's stay strong. Let's stay in this together. We will come out of this. We will be better. We will be stronger. Remember, Nietzsche said, "What does not kill you makes you stronger." I think it was Nietzsche, quoted by Conan the Barbarian. And good stuff. All right. God bless. Talk to you later.